203 motorcycles stood silent in the November rain outside St. Andrew's Church, their chrome dulled by the gray Missouri sky. The riders formed two perfect lines stretching from the iron gate to the weathered oak doors, each man and woman holding their helmet against their chest like a shield over their heart. Not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke. They simply waited, their leather vests dark with rain, their faces turned downward in a respect so absolute it felt like prayer. The taxi pulled to a stop 20 feet from the gate, its tires crunching on wet gravel. Inside, Eleanor Whitmore pressed her thin hand against the fogged window and tried to understand what she was seeing. She was 91 years old. Her bones ached in the cold. Her husband of 68 years had been dead for 6 days, and she had come to his funeral expecting emptiness. Instead, she found an army. The driver, a man named George who had known the Whitmores for 30 years, turned in his seat and stared through the windshield with his mouth slightly open. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I think they're waiting for you." Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for the door handle. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory surfaced like a ghost. Walter lying in their bed 6 days ago, his breath shallow, his hand cold in hers. His last words had been simple. "You won't be alone, Ellie. I promise you won't be alone." She had thought he meant in the way all dying husbands comfort their wives, with hope, with kindness, with lies meant to soften the inevitable loneliness that follows death like a shadow. Now, stepping out into the rain, Eleanor Whitmore realized her husband had meant something else entirely. A man stepped forward from the front of the left line. He was broad-shouldered and gray-bearded, his face weathered by wind and sun and years of hard living. He wore a black leather vest over a flannel shirt, and when he removed his helmet, Eleanor saw scars on his knuckles and kindness in his eyes. He walked toward her slowly, the way a man approaches something fragile, and when he reached her, he lowered himself onto one knee so that his face was level with hers. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. His voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that had given orders under fire and comfort in the dark. "My name is Garrett Dalton. People call me Bear. Your husband asked me to make sure you wouldn't be alone today." Eleanor stared at him. Rain dripped from the brim of his invisible hat, running in rivulets down his weathered face. Behind him, 203 people stood perfectly still, and for the first time in 6 days, Eleanor Whitmore felt something other than grief. She felt wonder. "Who are you?" she whispered. Bear smiled, just barely. "We're family, ma'am. We just didn't know it until yesterday." And then the question appeared, not on a screen, not in words, but in the stillness itself. A question that hung in the cold November air like breath made visible. What debt could bring 200 strangers to one man's funeral? The answer, Eleanor would soon learn, began 6 days earlier. In a small house on Willow Street, in a moment of discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about the man she had loved for nearly 7 decades. The house on Willow Street had been silent for 3 days. Eleanor Whitmore sat in the bedroom she had shared with her husband since 1956 and stared at the empty space where Walter used to sleep. The sheets were still wrinkled from where he had lain. The pillow still held the faint impression of his head. She had not washed them. She could not bring herself to erase the last physical evidence that he had existed in this room, in this bed, beside her. Walter had died on a Saturday night, quietly, peacefully, the way he had lived. He had been 93 years old. She had been with him when it happened, holding his hand, listening to his breathing grow slower and slower until it simply stopped. There had been no drama, no sudden crisis, just the gentle ebbing of a life well lived, slipping away like water through her fingers. "You'll be okay, won't you?" he had asked her in those final moments, his voice barely audible. "When I'm gone." "Don't talk like that," she had told him, even though they both knew the truth. "We still have time." He had smiled at her then, that same smile he had given her on their wedding day in 1956, that same smile he had given her when their son David was born. That same smile he had given her every morning for 68 years when she woke up beside him. 68 years, Ellie, he had whispered. That's enough. That's more than most people ever get. And then he had closed his eyes, squeezed her hand once, and let go. Eleanor had sat with his body for 2 hours before she called anyone. She had held his hand and talked to him the way she always had, telling him about the birds outside the window, about the neighbor's dog that wouldn't stop barking, about how the street light at the corner had finally been fixed after being broken for 3 months. She had talked to him because if she stopped talking, if she acknowledged the silence, then it would become real. Eventually, she had called the funeral home. They had been kind, professional. They had taken Walter's body and left her alone in a house that suddenly felt too large, too quiet, too empty. 3 days later, she had forced herself to begin the terrible work of preparing for his funeral. Reverend Thomas had come to the house on Tuesday afternoon. He was a young man, only in his 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He had sat with Eleanor in the living room and asked her the questions that needed to be asked. "Do you know how many people will be attending, Mrs. Whitmore?" Eleanor had looked down at her hands, folded in her lap like birds with broken wings. She had thought about this question for 3 days. She had made lists in her mind, counting and recounting, trying to find more names than actually existed. "Our son David passed away in 1998, she said quietly. "Car accident. He was only 42. We don't have any grandchildren." Reverend Thomas nodded, his pen hovering over his notepad. "Walter had 2 brothers," Eleanor continued, "both gone now. One died in 2006, the other in 2012. Most of our friends from church," she paused, her voice catching, "most of them are either gone or too sick to travel. Mrs. Harper next door might come, maybe, if her arthritis isn't too bad. And there's a woman from the ladies' auxiliary, Mrs. Miller, but she's in a wheelchair now, and I don't know if—" She stopped. The truth was too heavy to speak aloud. The truth was that Walter Whitmore would be buried in front of an empty room. Reverend Thomas had reached across the coffee table and placed his hand over hers. "Mrs. Whitmore, we'll make it a beautiful service regardless. Your husband will be honored with dignity and respect. I promise you that." Eleanor had nodded, but she had not believed him. How could a funeral be beautiful when no one came? How could a man who had lived 93 years, who had worked every day of his adult life, who had been a good husband and a good father and a good neighbor, leave this world to silence? After Reverend Thomas left, Eleanor had wandered through the house like a ghost. She had opened closets and drawers, looking for nothing in particular, touching Walter's clothes, his tools, his possessions. Each object was a memory. Each memory was a small death of its own. In the bedroom closet, behind Walter's old work shirts and the suit he had worn to David's funeral, Eleanor found a cardboard box she had never seen before. It was old, the corners worn soft with age, the tape yellowed and peeling. She pulled it down from the shelf and carried it to the bed. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, she found a photograph. The picture showed a young man standing beside a motorcycle. He wore blue jeans and a white t-shirt and a leather jacket with patches on the shoulders. His hair was dark and thick, combed back from his forehead. His smile was wide and confident, the smile of someone who had never known defeat. The motorcycle beside him gleamed in the sunlight, all chrome and black leather, a machine built for speed and freedom. Eleanor stared at the photograph for a long time before she realized she was looking at her husband. Walter had been 23 years old when this picture was taken. She had been 20 in 1954, still living with her parents, still working at the phone company, still dreaming about a future that felt impossibly far away. She had not met Walter until 1955. They had not married until 1956. This photograph came from a life before her, a life Walter had never mentioned. She turned the picture over. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were 4 words that made her hands begin to shake. Thunder Riders. Phoenix chapter. Beneath the writing, someone had sketched a small symbol, a lightning bolt piercing a skull. Eleanor set the photograph down carefully, as if it might explode, and reached back into the box. She found more pictures. Walter standing with a group of men beside their motorcycles. Walter sitting on a curb, a beer in his hand, laughing at something out of frame. Walter wearing a leather jacket covered in patches, his arm around the shoulders of another rider. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of old canvas, Eleanor found the jacket itself. It was heavy in her hands, the leather worn soft with use. The patches were still sewn onto the shoulders and the back, though some of the thread had come loose with age. Thunder Riders, the largest patch read, Phoenix chapter, established 1948. Eleanor held the jacket up to the light and tried to reconcile the man in these photographs with the man she had known. Walter Whitmore had been quiet, careful. He had worked as a radio repairman for 40 years, fixing televisions and radios in a small shop on Main Street. He had never raised his voice. He had never driven fast. The most dangerous thing he had ever done, as far as Eleanor knew, was climb a ladder to clean the gutters. But this jacket, these photographs, told a different story. They told the story of a man who had ridden motorcycles across state lines. A man who had belonged to something called Thunder Riders. A man who had lived a life full of speed and danger and brotherhood before he ever met Eleanor. And he had never told her. Not in 68 years of marriage. Not in all the quiet mornings and peaceful evenings and long conversations they had shared. He had kept this part of himself locked away, hidden in a box at the back of a closet, as secret as a second family. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, holding the jacket in her lap, and felt a grief she had not expected. It was not the grief of loss, though that pain was still fresh and raw. It was the grief of discovery, the grief of realizing that even after 68 years, the person you loved most in the world could still be a stranger. She reached back into the box one last time and found something else. A small metal pin, tarnished with age, attached to a strip of faded ribbon. Eleanor held it up to the light and felt her breath catch. It was a military service medal, Korean War, 1950 to 1953. Walter had served in Korea. She had known that. He had told her about it, though only in the vaguest terms. He had been young. It had been hard. He did not like to talk about it. That was all she knew. But now, looking at this medal, this jacket, these photographs, Eleanor began to understand something else. Walter Whitmore had come home from war and joined a motorcycle club. He had ridden across the Southwest with men who became his brothers. He had lived a life of freedom and danger, and something that looked, in these faded photographs, very much like joy. And then, for reasons she did not understand, he had walked away from all of it. He had sold the motorcycle. He had hung up the jacket. He had become the quiet, careful man she had married. Why? The question echoed in Eleanor's mind as she carefully folded the jacket and placed it back in the box. The question followed her as she carried the box downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. The question haunted her as she made herself a cup of tea she would not drink and sat alone in the house where she and Walter had built a life together. Why had he left that world behind? And more importantly, why had he never told her about it? Eleanor looked at the photograph of young Walter one more time. She studied his face, searching for clues. In the picture, he looked happy, free, alive in a way she had never seen him in all their years together. She wondered if he had missed it, that life, those men, that freedom. She wondered if, in all their years of marriage, he had ever regretted choosing her over them. The thought made her chest ache with a loneliness that had nothing to do with death and everything to do with the terrible distance that can exist between two people who share a bed. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows. Inside, Eleanor Whitmore sat alone at her kitchen table and cried for the husband she had loved and the stranger he had been. Tomorrow, she would bury him. And according to Reverend Thomas, almost no one would come. Walter Whitmore would leave this world the same way he had lived it, at least in Eleanor's experience. Quietly, without fanfare, without witnesses to mark his passing. She had accepted this. She had made her peace with it. What she did not know, what she could not possibly know, was that the photograph in her hands would change everything. Because tomorrow afternoon, in a moment of desperation and loneliness, Eleanor Whitmore would do something completely out of character. She would carry that photograph into a roadside diner. She would approach a table of strangers wearing leather and denim, and she would ask them for help. And those strangers, those rough men and women who looked like everything Walter had walked away from, would give her something she had never expected. They would give her an answer to the question that had been haunting her since she found that box in the closet. They would show her why Walter Whitmore had walked away from Thunder Riders. And they would prove, beyond any doubt, that Walter Whitmore had never been forgotten. The story that would unfold over the next 24 hours would involve 7 states, 203 motorcycles, one terrible blizzard, and a secret that had been kept for 55 years. But for now, on this quiet Tuesday evening in a house on Willow Street, Eleanor Whitmore simply sat at her kitchen table, holding a photograph of a man she thought she knew, and wondered what other secrets her husband had taken to his grave. Tomorrow she would find out. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow the thunder would begin to roll. Riley's Roadhouse Diner sat at the edge of Redwood Falls like a relic from another era. It was the kind of place that had been built in the 1950s and had never quite caught up to the present. The neon sign out front buzzed and flickered. The booths inside were covered in red vinyl, cracked and patched with duct tape. The coffee was strong and bitter. The pie was good. And the waitresses had been working there long enough to know everyone's order before they sat down. Eleanor had not been to Riley's in nearly 3 years. She and Walter used to come every Sunday after church, sitting in the same booth by the window, ordering the same meals they had ordered for decades. But arthritis had made the drive difficult. Then Walter's health had declined. Then Sunday dinners became something they could no longer manage. Now on this Sunday afternoon, Eleanor pushed open the door and stepped inside for the first time since Walter's death. The bell above the door chimed. A few heads turned, then turned back to their meals. Eleanor stood in the entryway, gripping her wooden cane, and tried to remember why she had come. The funeral was tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Reverend Thomas had called that morning to confirm the details. He had been gentle when he told her that only 2 people had called to confirm their attendance. Mrs. Harper from next door, and Mrs. Miller from the Ladies' Auxiliary. 2 people. Walter Whitmore would be buried in front of 2 people. The thought had driven Eleanor from her house. She could not sit in that empty kitchen for another moment. She could not stare at those photographs for another second. She had to do something, anything, to fill the terrible silence that had consumed her life. So she had called a taxi and asked to be taken to Riley's. She had no plan, no clear purpose. She simply needed to be somewhere other than that house. Now, standing in the diner, Eleanor realized she had made a mistake. Because sitting in the corner booth, taking up more space than seemed physically possible, were 4 people who did not belong in Redwood Falls. They were bikers. Eleanor knew this immediately, though she could not have explained how. Maybe it was the leather vests they wore, covered in patches and pins. Maybe it was the way they sat, sprawled and confident, taking up space with the ease of people who had never been told to make themselves smaller. Maybe it was the motorcycle she had seen parked outside, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Or maybe it was simply that they looked dangerous. Not in a threatening way, not in a way that made Eleanor want to turn and leave, but dangerous in the sense that they had lived lives far removed from the quiet safety of Redwood Falls. Dangerous in the way that people who have seen too much of the world can never quite wash it off. The largest of the 4 was a man in his late 50s, with a gray beard and shoulders that looked like they had been carved from stone. He wore a black leather vest over a red flannel shirt, and his hands, wrapped around a coffee mug, were scarred and thick-knuckled. Beside him sat an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a calm, measuring gaze. He looked like a professor, except for the leather and the tattoos visible on his forearms. Across from them sat a younger man, early 30s, with dark hair and restless energy. He drummed his fingers on the table and checked his phone every few seconds, as if waiting for news that would not come. And beside the younger man sat a woman in her mid-40s with short cropped hair and eyes that had seen things Eleanor could only imagine. She wore the same leather vest as the men, and she held her coffee cup with both hands, staring into it like it held answers. Eleanor stood by the door for nearly 10 minutes watching them, gathering courage that seemed to evaporate every time she tried to take a step forward. She thought about her son David when he was 7 years old, pointing at a group of motorcycles parked outside a gas station. "Mama, why do those people look so scary?" And Eleanor had told him what her own mother had told her. "You can't judge people by how they look, sweetheart. Sometimes the roughest exteriors hide the kindest hearts." Now, 60 years later, Eleanor decided to believe her own words. She walked across the diner floor, her cane tapping against the linoleum, and approached the corner booth. The four bikers noticed her immediately. The younger man stopped drumming his fingers. The woman looked up. The older man with glasses nodded politely. The bearded man in the center set down his coffee and met her eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "can we help you?" Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Now that she was standing here, now that four pairs of eyes were looking at her expectantly, the entire idea seemed insane. What had she been thinking? That she could walk up to complete strangers and ask them to attend her husband's funeral? That they would care about an old woman's loneliness? "I'm sorry," she managed to say. "I shouldn't bother you. She turned to leave, but the bearded man stood up. "Ma'am," he said again, "you're not bothering anyone. You look like you came over here for a reason. Would you like to sit down?" Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, and she saw something she had not expected to see in the eyes of a man covered in leather and scars. She saw kindness. Eleanor's voice trembled. "My husband passed away last week. We were married for 68 years. The four bikers' expressions changed immediately. The restless energy drained from the younger man. The woman set down her coffee. The older man with glasses removed his cap and placed it on the table. "I'm very sorry for your loss," the bearded man said quietly. Eleanor nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. "His funeral is tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, at St. Andrew's Church. But there's—" She paused, embarrassed by how small and pathetic the problem sounded when spoken aloud. "There's almost no one left to come. Most of our friends are gone. Our son died years ago. I'm afraid Walter will be buried with an empty room." She forced herself to continue, even though every word felt like pulling glass from her throat. "I know this sounds crazy. I know you don't know me, but I saw you sitting here and I thought—" She reached into her purse with trembling hands and pulled out the photograph, the one of young Walter standing beside his motorcycle. "I thought maybe, if you knew that my husband used to be like you, maybe you might consider coming, just so he's not alone." She held out the photograph. The bearded man took it carefully, as if it were made of something precious. He looked at it for a long moment. Then his eyes widened. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "what was your husband's name?" "Walter. Walter Whitmore. People used to call him Wrench, I think. I just found out about all this a few days ago. I never knew he—" Her voice broke. The bearded man stared at the photograph. Then he looked up at Eleanor with an expression she could not read. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "can you give me a moment?" He handed the photograph to the older man with glasses, who looked at it and immediately straightened in his seat. The photograph passed to the woman, whose hand went to her mouth. Then to the younger man, who let out a low whistle. The bearded man pulled out his phone and walked a few steps away. Eleanor heard him say something in a low voice, but she could not make out the words. When he came back, his entire demeanor had changed. He was no longer simply kind. He looked shaken. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "my name is Garrett Dalton. People call me Bear. This is Isaiah Brennan, Rhett McKenna, and Vivian O'Malley. We're with the Iron Brotherhood Motorcycle Club." He paused. "And if you're telling me that your husband was Walter Wrench Whitmore from Thunder Rider's Phoenix chapter, then you need to know something." Eleanor waited. "Your husband," Bear said slowly, "was a legend." The word hung in the air like smoke. "What?" Eleanor whispered. Bear looked at the other three bikers, then back at Eleanor. "Ma'am, I don't know how much you know about your husband's past, but Walter Whitmore saved lives, a lot of lives, and the Brotherhood never forgot." Eleanor felt her legs weaken. Bear immediately took her arm and guided her into the booth beside Vivian, who moved over to make room. "I don't understand," Eleanor said. Bear sat down across from her. "Mrs. Whitmore, you said the funeral is tomorrow morning?" Eleanor nodded. "And you said you need people there, so your husband isn't alone." "Yes, I know it's asking a lot. I just thought—" Bear held up his hand. "Ma'am, you don't need to explain. We'll be there." Eleanor felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly made her sob. Thank you so much. Even just the four of you, it means—" "No," Bear said gently. "You're not understanding me. I said we'll be there. Not just us, all of us." Eleanor blinked. "I don't—" Bear pulled out his phone. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to make some calls tonight. And tomorrow morning, when you arrive at that church, you're not going to see an empty room. I promise you that." Isaiah leaned forward. "Ma'am, your husband was one of us, and we take care of our own, even when they're gone." Vivian reached over and squeezed Eleanor's hand. "You won't be alone tomorrow, and neither will he." Eleanor looked at their faces, these rough strangers who had become something else in the span of 5 minutes. She thought about Walter, young and strong in that photograph, standing beside his motorcycle with that confident smile. She thought about the life he had lived before her, the brotherhood he had belonged to, the man he had been. "Why did he leave?" she asked quietly. "If he was part of this, why did he walk away?" Bear's expression softened. "I don't know, ma'am, but I'd guess he had a pretty good reason." He looked down at the photograph one more time, then handed it back to Eleanor. "Tomorrow morning," he said, 10 o'clock. We'll be there." Eleanor took the photograph with shaking hands. "I can't thank you enough." "Yes, you can," Bear said. "You can tell us about him, about the life he lived after he left us, because that's the part of the story we never got to hear." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. As she left the diner 10 minutes later, climbed back into the taxi, and rode home through the fading afternoon light, she had no idea what she had just set in motion. She had no idea that Bear's "some calls" would become dozens of calls, then hundreds of messages, spreading across 7 states like wildfire. She had no idea that the simple request she had made, born of loneliness and desperation, would bring together people who had never met, from places she had never been, all bound by a code she did not understand. All she knew was that tomorrow, Walter would not be alone. And for now, that was enough. The message went out at 9 o'clock on Sunday night. Bear sat in his motel room 15 miles outside Redwood Falls, his phone glowing in the darkness, and typed words he knew would change everything. He had been riding for 32 years. He had seen brothers come and go, clubs rise and fall, legends born and forgotten. But this was different. This was about a debt that transcended clubs and patches and territorial lines. This was about a man who had saved lives and asked for nothing in return. The group chat was called Iron Brotherhood National Network. 412 members across 7 states, from Texas to Illinois, from Kansas to Tennessee. Most of them Bear had never met in person. Some he knew only by their road names, voices on the other end of a crackling phone line at 3 in the morning when someone needed help. But they were brothers nonetheless. And when Bear sent the message, he knew every single one of them would read it. Walter Wrench Whitmore, Thunder Riders, Phoenix Chapter, 1954. Korean War veteran, survived combat, came home, rode free. August 1969, Interstate 40 crash. 6 Thunder Riders down, 2 dead on scene, 4 trapped under burning wreckage. Walter Whitmore pulled them out. All 4 survived. He was 38 years old, married with a kid, just driving through. Could have kept going. Didn't. After the rescue, he vanished. Sold his bike, cut all ties. We never knew why. Now we do. He chose family. He chose quiet. He chose a different kind of courage. His widow just asked me for help. She thinks nobody will come to his funeral tomorrow morning. 10 a.m., St. Andrew's Church, Redwood Falls, Missouri. She asked for a few people so he wouldn't be alone. I say we give her more than a few. I say we show her what brotherhood means. I say we remind the world that legends never die. They just ride on different roads. Who's with me? Bear attached the photograph Eleanor had given him. Young Walter standing beside his Harley-Davidson. That confident smile, that Thunder Rider's patch on his shoulder. A man in his prime. A man who had no idea that 15 years later, he would run into burning wreckage to save people he had never met. Then Bear hit send and waited. The first reply came within 30 seconds. Rolling out now, 2 hours from Kansas City, count me in. Then another. Springfield chapter, 6 riders, we'll be there. Then the flood began. Bear's phone buzzed continuously for the next hour. Messages poured in from every corner of the network. Riders in motel rooms and truck stops and home garages, all seeing the same message, all making the same decision. By 10 o'clock, 47 riders had confirmed. By 10:30, 92. By 11, 136. Bear sat on the edge of his motel bed and watched the number climb. Isaiah sat across from him, cleaning his glasses, his face unreadable. Rhett paced the room, checking his phone every few seconds. Vivian stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot where their 4 motorcycles sat in a neat row. "This is going to be big," Rhett said. Bear nodded slowly. "Yeah, it is." "Does she know, the widow?" "No, and we're not going to tell her. Let it be a surprise." Vivian turned from the window. "You think she can handle it? 200 bikers showing up might be a shock." Bear thought about Eleanor Whitmore, that fragile 91-year-old woman who had walked up to their table with trembling hands and asked for help. He thought about the courage it must have taken, the desperation, the love. "She'll handle it," he said. "She's stronger than she looks." At 11:15, a new name appeared in the chat. Someone Bear had not expected to hear from. Silas McDougal, old-timer, from Illinois. The message was short. "I'm the boy, the 5-year-old, the one Walter saved. My father was Declan McDougal, Thunder Riders. He died in 1982, lived 13 more years because of Walter Whitmore. I have to be there. I owe him everything." Bear stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed a reply. "Front row, left side, I'll save you a spot." By midnight, 156 riders had confirmed. They were coming from Wichita and Oklahoma City, from Little Rock and Memphis, from Springfield and Tulsa, and towns so small they barely appeared on maps. Some were riding solo. Others were bringing their chapters, entire groups rolling out in formation, all of them heading toward a small church in Redwood Falls, Missouri, all of them coming to honor a man they had never met. Bear finally put down his phone at 12:30 and looked at the other 3. "We should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." But none of them slept much. How could they? Outside, in the darkness, across 7 states, the thunder was already beginning to roll. Headlights cut through the night on empty highways. Engines rumbled through sleeping towns. And 200 riders, most of them strangers to each other, rode toward the same destination with the same purpose. to make sure that Walter Whitmore did not leave this world alone. Somewhere in the darkness, 300 miles away, Delaney Fitzgerald was leading a convoy of 34 riders through Kansas when the snow began to fall. It started as a few flakes dancing in her headlight, beautiful and harmless. Within 10 minutes, it had become a wall of white that reduced visibility to almost nothing. The temperature dropped, the wind picked up, and the road that had been clear asphalt moments before transformed into a sheet of black ice. Delaney raised her left hand, signaling the convoy to slow down. Behind her, 33 headlights did the same, a line of light stretching back into the storm. She had been riding for 20 years. She had seen worse weather, but she had never ridden through worse weather with this many people depending on her. The radio in her helmet crackled. "Ghost, this is getting bad. Should we find shelter?" Delaney checked her GPS. They were still 2 hours from Redwood Falls. If they stopped now, they might not make it to the funeral on time. But if they kept going and someone got hurt, the whole point of this ride would be lost. "Stay tight," she said into the radio. "We keep moving, but slow and steady. Nobody plays hero." The convoy continued through the blizzard, their speed dropping to 30 miles per hour, then 20, then 15. The snow fell so thick that Delaney could barely see the taillights of the rider in front of her. The cold cut through her leather like knives. Her hands went numb on the handlebars despite her gloves. And then, 2 miles ahead of her, one of the riders went down. Delaney saw the red taillights suddenly veer sideways, then disappear. She hit her brakes carefully, feeling her own tires slip on the ice, and brought her bike to a stop. Behind her, the entire convoy stopped. She climbed off her bike and ran forward through the snow. The fallen rider was a kid named Cody, 24 years old, riding his first long-distance run. His motorcycle lay on its side in the ditch, back wheel still spinning. Cody sat beside it, holding his wrist, his face pale. "I'm okay," he said immediately. "I'm okay, just slipped. You guys keep going." Delaney knelt beside him. "Let me see your wrist." "It's fine, really. Don't let me slow you down." But Delaney was already examining his bike. The fall had damaged the brake line. Hydraulic fluid leaked onto the snow, dark against white. Without brakes, the motorcycle was a death trap. Another rider approached. His name was Rick, a hard-faced man in his 40s who had been riding longer than Cody had been alive. He looked at the bike, then at Delaney, then at his watch. "We don't have time for this," Rick said. "We're already behind schedule. If we stop to fix his bike, we'll miss the funeral." Delaney stood up slowly. "Then we'll miss the funeral." "Ghost, come on. The whole point of this ride is to show up for that widow. We can't help her if we're stuck on the side of the road fixing some kid's bike." Delaney stepped closer to Rick. She was 6 inches shorter than him, but in that moment, she seemed 10 feet tall. "The whole point of this ride," she said quietly, "is to show that brotherhood means something, that we don't leave people behind, that when someone falls, we stop and help them up. If we leave this kid here to make it to some funeral on time, then we're not brothers. We're just a bunch of strangers on motorcycles pretending to care." Rick stared at her. Behind them, the other riders had gathered, 32 people standing in a blizzard, waiting to see what would happen next. "We fixed the bike," Delaney said. "All of us, together. And then we all ride in together. Or none of us do." She turned to Cody. "How bad is your wrist?" "Sprained, I think, but I can ride." Delaney looked at the broken brake line, then at her own bike. She would have to sacrifice a section of her own line to repair his. It would take time, maybe an hour, maybe more. They would definitely be late, but they would all be together. She knelt in the snow and started working. The other riders formed a circle around her, blocking the wind, shining their headlights to give her visibility. Someone produced a toolkit. Someone else had spare hydraulic fluid. They worked together with the practiced efficiency of people who had been doing this their entire lives, helping each other, covering for each other's weaknesses. 45 minutes later, Cody's bike was running again. Delaney's hands were purple with cold. Her fingers shook so badly she could barely grip her handlebars. But the brake line held. Cody tried to thank her, tears freezing on his face. Delaney cut him off. "Don't thank me. Just remember this when someone else needs help. Remember that we stop. Always. No matter what." They climbed back their bikes and continued through the storm. They were now 3 hours behind schedule. They would arrive at Redwood Falls after the funeral had already started. But they would arrive together, all 34 of them, and that mattered more than punctuality. As they rode through the darkness, Delaney thought about what Bear had said in his message. Walter Whitmore could have kept driving. He could have seen that burning wreckage and told himself it wasn't his problem. But he had stopped. He had run into fire. He had saved lives. Now, 55 years later, people who had never met him were doing the same thing. Stopping, helping, sacrificing. The legend was still alive. It was just riding different roads. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, 197 riders had arrived in Redwood Falls. They came in small groups and large convoys, their headlights appearing on the dark roads like earthbound stars. They came from Texas and Arkansas and Oklahoma and Kansas and Missouri and Illinois and Tennessee. Riders who had nothing in common except the code they lived by. They parked their motorcycles in neat rows along the streets surrounding St. Andrew's Church. They turned off their engines and stood in the pre-dawn cold, breath steaming in the November air, waiting for the sun to rise. Bear stood at the church gate at 5 in the morning and watched them arrive. He had stopped counting after the number passed 150. He had stopped trying to memorize names and faces. There were too many. They just kept coming. Isaiah stood beside him, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "You think the church can hold all of them?" "No," Bear said. "Not even close." "So what do we do?" Bear looked at the growing crowd. "We line them up outside, 2 rows from the gate to the doors. Honor guard. When Mrs. Whitmore arrives, she walks between them. And inside? First come, first served. Everyone else stands outside and pays their respects when the casket comes out." Vivian appeared from the darkness, her breath visible in the cold. "Sheriff's here." Bear turned and saw the police cruiser pulling up to the church. 2 officers got out, their hands resting on their belts, their faces wary. The lead officer was a man in his mid-50s with gray hair and a sheriff's star on his chest. His name tag read, Brennan. Sheriff Hank Brennan approached slowly, taking in the rows of motorcycles, the growing crowd of leather-vested riders, the sheer improbability of what he was seeing. "Someone want to tell me what's going on here?" he asked. Bear stepped forward. "We're here for a funeral, Sheriff." "A funeral? At 5 in the morning?" "The service is at 10. We wanted to get here early, make sure everything was ready." Sheriff Brennan looked at the crowd again. Bear could see him counting, trying to estimate numbers, assessing threat levels. "How many of you are there?" "Last count, 197. Might be more by the time the service starts." The sheriff's eyes widened. 200 bikers showing up for a funeral in Redwood Falls? For who? We don't have any motorcycle clubs here. We barely have any motorcycles. "Walter Whitmore," Bear said. "He died last week. We knew him. A long time ago." "Walter Whitmore?" The sheriff's confusion deepened. "Walter and Eleanor Whitmore? They lived on Willow Street for 60 years. I've known them my whole life. Walter never rode a motorcycle. He fixed radios." Bear pulled out his phone and showed the sheriff the photograph. Young Walter, the Harley Davidson, the Thunder Riders patch. Sheriff Brennan stared at the picture for a long time. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "I had no idea." "Neither did his wife," Bear said, "until a few days ago." The sheriff looked up at the crowd again, his expression changing. The wariness was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Understanding. Maybe even respect. "You're all here for Walter Whitmore," he said as if testing the words. Yes, sir. 200 people riding across state lines to honor a man most of you never met. Yes, sir. Sheriff Brennan was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. All right, but I need you to keep order. No trouble. This is a small town. People are going to be scared when they see this many bikers. We understand, Sheriff. We're not here to cause problems. We're here to pay our respects. Fair enough. The sheriff turned to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth, Walter was a good man. Fixed my dad's radio for free when we couldn't afford to pay for it. Fixed a lot of people's radios for free. Never made a big deal about it. Just did it because it was the right thing to do. Bear smiled slightly. Sounds like the Walter we heard about. As the sun began to rise, the town of Redwood Falls woke up to something it had never seen before. 200 motorcycles parked in perfect rows. 200 riders standing in quiet formation. And a small church that suddenly looked like it was under siege by an army of leather and chrome. Mrs. Millicent Harper, Eleanor's next-door neighbor, was the first to call the police. She looked out her window at 6:30 and saw the crowd and immediately assumed the worst. Within minutes, 3 more police cars arrived. Within an hour, word had spread through the entire town. There were bikers at the church, hundreds of them. Something terrible was about to happen. But as the morning progressed and nothing terrible occurred, curiosity began to replace fear. People drove by slowly, staring. Some stopped and asked questions. The bikers answered politely, explaining they were there for Walter Whitmore's funeral. Gradually, the fear began to fade. At 7 o'clock, a woman named Maggie O'Brien, who owned the coffee shop on Main Street, drove up in her pickup truck with 5 thermoses of hot coffee. Thought you folks might be cold, she said. The bikers thanked her. Some of them had tears in their eyes. They had been expecting hostility, maybe even confrontation. Instead, they were getting coffee. By 8 o'clock, Mrs. Harper herself appeared with a basket of homemade muffins. I'm sorry I called the police, she said to Bear. I was scared, but Eleanor told me yesterday that she had asked some bikers to come. I didn't realize she meant all of you. It's all right, ma'am, Bear said. We understand. Walter was a good neighbor, Mrs. Harper continued. Quiet man, always willing to help if you needed something fixed. I can't believe I never knew about this part of his life. He kept it private, Bear said, for his own reasons. At 8:15, a silver sedan pulled up and an old man climbed out slowly, using a cane for support. He wore a leather jacket that had seen better days, covered in patches that were faded and torn. On the back, barely visible, were the words, Thunder Riders. Bear recognized him from his messages. Silas McDougal, old-timer, the 5-year-old boy from the crash. Except he was not a boy anymore. He was 60 years old, his hair completely gray, his face lined with decades of living. But his eyes were bright and clear, and when he looked at the crowd of riders, those eyes filled with tears. Bear walked over to meet him. Silas? The old man nodded. Bear? They shook hands, then embraced. 2 strangers who had never met, connected by a debt neither of them had incurred, but both of them intended to honor. I can't believe this many people came, Silas said, looking at the crowd. Walter saved your father. That makes you family, and family shows up. Silas wiped his eyes. I've been waiting 55 years to say thank you to this man. I thought I'd never get the chance. You'll get it today, Bear said. When we carry him to his rest, you'll be right there beside him. They stood together in the growing light, watching as more riders continued to arrive. By 8:30, the count had reached 203. By 9 o'clock, it was 207. By 9:15, Delaney's convoy from Kansas finally appeared on the horizon. All 34 riders intact despite the blizzard, despite Cody's crash, despite everything. Bear greeted Delaney with a nod of respect. Heard you had trouble. Nothing we couldn't handle, Delaney said. Her hands were still purple from the cold, but her eyes were fierce with pride. We don't leave anyone behind. No, Bear agreed, we don't. At 9:30, Bear gathered everyone together, and explained the plan. 2 lines from the gate to the church doors. Stand at attention. Helmets held over hearts. Complete silence. When Mrs. Whitmore arrives, let her walk between you. When the service ends, each person will have a chance to pay their respects at the casket. No rush, no pushing. We have all the time in the world. The riders formed up with military precision. They created a corridor of leather and respect. 207 people who had ridden through the night, through blizzards and exhaustion and doubt, all for the same reason. Because a man they never met had once stopped to help people who needed it. Because legends deserve to be remembered. Because brotherhood means something. At 9:45, as the riders stood in perfect formation, and the town of Redwood Falls watched in amazement from sidewalks and porches, Reverend Thomas emerged from the church. He looked at the crowd, and his jaw dropped. Bear walked over to him. "Reverend, I'm Garrett Dalton. Mrs. Whitmore asked us to come to the funeral. I hope that's not a problem." Reverend Thomas tried to speak, failed, tried again. "How many of you are there?" 207, last count. 207 people came for Walter Whitmore. "Yes, sir." The Reverend looked at the formation, at the motorcycles gleaming in the morning sun, at the faces of men and women who had traveled hundreds of miles for this moment. "Mrs. Whitmore said she asked for a few people." "She did," Bear said. "We decided a few wasn't enough." Reverend Thomas smiled then, a real smile, the kind that comes from witnessing something beautiful and unexpected. Walter would have been amazed. "Walter," Silas said, stepping forward, "was amazing. That's why we're here." At 9:55, a taxi appeared at the end of the street. Bear raised his hand. 207 riders immediately fell silent. They removed their helmets and held them against their chests. They stood perfectly still, a living monument to a man who had chosen family over freedom and had never regretted it. The taxi drove slowly up the street, past the endless rows of motorcycles, past the silent watchers, past everything Eleanor Whitmore had expected her husband's funeral to be. And when it stopped at the church gate, when the door opened, when a fragile 91-year-old woman stepped out into the November morning and saw what waited for her, the entire world held its breath. Because this was the moment. This was the answer to the question that had haunted Eleanor since she found that photograph in the closet. This was why Walter Whitmore had walked away from Thunder Riders. Not because he stopped caring, not because the brotherhood meant nothing, but because some loves are worth more than freedom, and some choices define a life more than any adventure ever could. Eleanor stood beside the taxi, staring at 207 people she had never met, and finally understood the man she had loved for 68 years. Bear stepped forward, lowered himself to one knee, and said the words that would change everything. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're here. We're all here, and your husband will not be alone." Eleanor's hands shook. Her eyes filled with tears. And for the first time since Walter died, she smiled. Because she realized something in that moment, something profound and beautiful and true. Walter had not left Thunder Riders behind. He had simply expanded what brotherhood meant. He had taken the code he learned on those highways, the loyalty and sacrifice and courage, and he had lived it in a different way. With her, with David, with every neighbor whose radio he fixed for free, and every stranger who needed help. He had not abandoned his brothers. He had become a brother to everyone. And now, 55 years after he had pulled 4 men from burning wreckage and changed his life forever, the brothers were returning the favor. They were pulling Eleanor from her own wreckage, the wreckage of loneliness and grief. And they were showing her that she had never been alone. None of them had. That was what brotherhood meant. Bear stood up and offered Eleanor his arm. She took it with trembling hands. Together they walked between 207 silent riders, each one bowing their head as she passed, each one honoring the woman who had given Walter Whitmore a reason to choose love over legend. And behind them, The sun rose over Redwood Falls, turning the chrome and steel into rivers of light. The funeral was about to begin, but the real story, the story of what happens when legends meet love and brotherhood meets grief, and 200 strangers become family in the space of a single morning, was just getting started. Eleanor Whitmore walked between 207 silent riders and felt the weight of 68 years lift from her shoulders like a bird taking flight. Each step forward was a step through time, past the grief, past the loneliness, past the terrible fear that Walter would disappear from this world without anyone noticing he had ever been here at all. Bear's arm was solid beneath her trembling hand. He moved slowly, matching her pace, never rushing, never pulling. Behind her, she could hear George, the taxi driver, following at a respectful distance, his footsteps crunching on gravel. And on either side, like walls of living stone, the riders stood with their helmets pressed against their hearts. Eleanor looked at their faces as she passed. Old men with gray beards and young men with tattoos. Women with short hair and hard eyes. People who looked like they had seen every corner of America and survived things she could not imagine. But in every face she saw the same expression. Respect, not pity, not sympathy, not the sad, gentle condescension people usually gave to 91-year-old widows at funerals. This was something else entirely. This was the respect soldiers gave to fallen brothers. The respect that comes from recognizing courage, even when that courage wore the quiet disguise of an ordinary life. Halfway down the corridor, Eleanor stopped. Bear looked down at her with concern. "Are you all right, ma'am? Do you need to rest?" Eleanor shook her head. She was looking at a woman in her mid-40s who stood at attention with tears streaming down her face. The woman's leather vest had a patch that read, "Viper," and her hands gripped her helmet so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "What's your name, dear?" Eleanor asked softly. The woman seemed startled to be addressed. "Vivian, ma'am. Vivian O'Malley. You came a long way?" "San Antonio, ma'am. About 800 miles. Eleanor studied Vivian's face. She saw grief there, old and familiar, the kind of grief that never fully heals. "You've lost someone," she said. It was not a question. Vivian nodded, unable to speak. "Recently? 5 years ago, my husband." Eleanor reached out with her free hand and touched Vivian's arm. "I'm sorry for your loss. Were there many people at his funeral?" Vivian's voice cracked. 8 people, ma'am. His mother, his sister, 6 friends. That was all." Eleanor squeezed her arm gently. "Then I'm especially glad you're here, because you understand." "Yes, ma'am, I understand." Eleanor continued walking, and as she did, she began to see the stories written in each face she passed. The young man with the healing road rash on his arms, who had clearly crashed sometime in the last few weeks. The older man with the Thunder Rider's patch, who stood with military precision, tears running unashamedly down his weathered face. The woman with gray hair who held a photograph clutched against her chest, probably someone she had lost. Each of them had come here carrying their own grief, their own losses, their own understanding of what it meant to leave this world alone. And each of them had decided that Walter Whitmore would not suffer that fate. When Eleanor finally reached the church doors, she turned and looked back down the corridor she had just walked. 207 people stood frozen in place like a photograph of devotion. The morning sun had risen fully now, turning the scene into something almost supernatural. Light glinted off chrome and leather. Shadows stretched long across the ground. And in the perfect silence, Eleanor could almost hear Walter's voice. "See, Ellie? I told you that you wouldn't be alone." She had thought he meant in the abstract way that all dying people comfort their loved ones. She had not understood that he meant it literally. That somehow, even in death, he had arranged for this. That the life he had lived before her, the brotherhood he had walked away from, had been waiting all these years to return this one final kindness. Bear opened the church door, and Eleanor stepped inside. The sanctuary was packed. Every pew was filled with riders, sitting shoulder to shoulder, their leather vests a stark contrast to the white walls and wooden crosses. More people stood along the walls, filling every available space. The air smelled of old wood and candle wax, and the faint scent of motor oil that seemed to cling to everyone who rode. At the front of the church, on a simple wooden platform, sat Walter's casket. Eleanor had chosen a plain pine box, the cheapest option the funeral home offered, because their savings were modest and she saw no point in extravagance for a body that would return to dust. But someone had covered it with flowers, white roses, dozens of them, arranged in careful bundles. She had not ordered flowers. She could not afford flowers. Reverend Thomas stood beside the casket, his eyes red, his expression stunned. He had prepared a simple service for two people. Instead, he was looking at a church so full that fire codes were probably being violated. Bear guided Eleanor to the front pew. As she sat down, she noticed someone else already sitting there, an old man with a cane and a faded Thunder Rider's jacket. He stood up slowly when she approached and extended his hand. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "my name is Silas McDougall. Your husband saved my father's life in 1969. I was 5 years old. Because of Walter, I got to grow up with a dad. I got 13 more years with him before he passed. 13 years I would never have had." Eleanor took his hand, which was gnarled with arthritis but warm with life. "You were there? At the accident?" "No, ma'am. I was home with my mother, waiting for my dad to come back from a ride. He almost didn't. Your husband made sure he did." Silas sat down beside her, and together they faced the casket that held a man who had changed both their lives in different ways. Reverend Thomas cleared his throat, and the church fell silent. 207 people became utterly still. The Reverend opened his Bible, looked down at it, then closed it again. He seemed to realize that the words he had prepared, the standard funeral homily about eternal rest and God's mercy, were not adequate for this moment. "I've been a minister for 28 years, he began. "I've conducted more funerals than I can count. And I've learned that you can tell a lot about a person by who shows up when they die. Not by how many people come necessarily, but by why they come. Whether they come out of obligation or genuine love. Whether they're there to mourn or to celebrate. Whether they knew the deceased as they truly were or only as they appeared to be." He paused, looking out at the crowd. "I knew Walter Whitmore for 15 years. He and Eleanor attended this church faithfully. He was quiet, reserved. He fixed the church's sound system twice without asking for payment. He brought Eleanor to service every Sunday until his health made it impossible. And in all that time, he never once mentioned that he used to ride motorcycles, that he had served in Korea, that he had been part of something called Thunder Riders, that he had saved lives." Reverend Thomas gestured to the packed church. "But all of you knew, or you learned, and you came here from 7 different states, riding through the night, to honor a man most of you never met. That tells me something about Walter Whitmore. It tells me that the life he lived before Eleanor, the brotherhood he belonged to, recognized something in him that was worth remembering, something worth celebrating, something worth riding 800 miles to honor." He looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you like to say a few words about your husband?" Eleanor had not prepared anything. She had assumed no one would be here to listen. But now, faced with 207 expectant faces, she found words coming that she had not known she possessed. She stood up slowly, gripping the pew for support, and turned to face the congregation. "I married Walter Whitmore in 1956, she said, her voice thin but steady. "He was 25 years old. I was 23. We had met the year before at a church social. He was quiet, polite. He asked me to dance and stepped on my feet twice." A few soft chuckles rippled through the church. "But he was kind, and that mattered more than dancing." Eleanor paused, gathering her thoughts. "We had a simple wedding, a simple life. Walter worked as a radio repairman. I worked part-time at the library. We had one son, David. We bought a house on Willow Street. We went to church on Sundays. We ate dinner together every night at 6 o'clock. For 68 years, that was our life. Simple, quiet, unremarkable. She looked at the casket. 3 days ago, I found a box in our closet. Inside were photographs of a man I didn't recognize. A young man on a motorcycle. A man wearing a leather jacket with patches. A man who looked confident and strong and free. And I realized that before Walter was my husband, before he was David's father, before he was the quiet radio repairman on Main Street, he was someone else entirely. Eleanor's voice grew stronger. I spent 2 days being angry about that. Angry that he never told me. Angry that he kept this secret for 68 years. But then I understood something. Walter didn't keep it secret because he was ashamed. He kept it secret because that part of his life was finished. He had chosen a different path. He had chosen me. He had chosen David. He had chosen the simple, quiet life that I thought was unremarkable. She turned to face the riders. But it wasn't unremarkable, was it? Because the same man who pulled 4 strangers from a burning wreck in 1969 was the same man who fixed Mrs. Harper's radio every time it broke and never charged her a cent. The same courage that made him run into fire made him get up every morning and make me breakfast for 68 years, even when his hands shook from arthritis. The same loyalty that bound him to Thunder Riders bound him to me, to our son, to our neighbors, to everyone who needed help and never asked for it. Eleanor wiped her eyes. Walter didn't stop being a Thunder Rider when he married me. He just expanded what that meant. He became a brother to everyone. And now, all these years later, the brothers have come back to tell me something I needed to hear. To tell me that Walter Whitmore's life mattered, that he made a difference, that legends don't die just because they choose different roads. She sat down. The church was completely silent. Then, slowly, one person began to clap, then another. Then the entire congregation was applauding, standing, 207 people giving a 91-year-old widow a standing ovation for loving a man well enough to let him be both things at once. Legend and husband, hero and ordinary man. When the applause finally faded, Silas stood up. "May I say something, Reverend?" Thomas nodded. Silas walked to the front, leaning heavily on his cane. He stood beside the casket and placed one weathered hand on the pine wood. August 14th, 1969, Interstate 40 just outside Flagstaff, Arizona. 6 Thunder Riders heading east. My father, Declan McDougall, was riding sweep, last in formation. A truck driver fell asleep at the wheel, crossed the median, hit the convoy head on. His voice was steady, but his hand trembled on the casket. 2 riders died instantly. 4 were trapped under burning wreckage. The truck driver was dead. Traffic stopped in both directions. People got out of their cars and stood there, watching, doing nothing. The fire was too hot. The screaming was too loud. Everyone assumed those 4 men were already dead. Silas looked up at the congregation. Everyone except Walter Whitmore. He was 38 years old, driving with his wife, just passing through. He could have kept driving. Nobody would have blamed him. But he stopped. He ran into fire that was hot enough to melt steel. He pulled 4 men out, one by one, while the metal burned his hands and the smoke filled his lungs. My father was the last one, half conscious, begging Walter to leave him and save himself. Silas's voice broke. Walter told him, "You've got a son waiting for you at home. You're going to see him again." And he dragged my father out 30 seconds before the whole thing exploded. He turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitmore, after the accident, Walter disappeared. The Thunder Riders tried to find him, tried to thank him, tried to make him a legend in every chapter across the country. But he was gone. We didn't understand why. We thought maybe he didn't want the attention. Maybe he was too humble. Maybe he just wanted to forget." Silas smiled through his tears. "But now I understand. He didn't disappear because he wanted to forget. He disappeared because he wanted to remember what mattered most. You, your son, the family he was building. He traded legend for love, and that's the most heroic thing any man can do. He looked around the church. Every person in this room came here because of what Walter did 55 years ago, because the story got passed down, father to son, rider to rider, chapter to chapter. The man who ran into fire and saved 4 lives and asked for nothing in return. That story became part of who we are, part of the code we live by. Stop when someone needs help. Risk everything to save a brother. Never leave anyone behind. Silas placed both hands on the casket now. Walter Whitmore, I've waited 55 years to say this. Thank you. Thank you for giving me my father. Thank you for giving me 13 more years of memories. Thank you for teaching me, without ever knowing it, what it means to be brave. You're a legend, sir. Not because you rode a motorcycle, not because you wore a patch, but because when the moment came, when it mattered most, you didn't hesitate. You ran toward the fire instead of away from it. He stepped back and saluted, a crisp military salute that he held for 5 full seconds. Then he sat down beside Eleanor and wept like a child. One by one, other riders stood and shared their stories. Not stories about Walter because most of them had never met him, but stories about what his legacy had inspired them to do. The times they had stopped to help someone on the side of the road. The times they had risked their own safety to pull someone from a wreck. The times they had chosen courage over comfort because somewhere, decades ago, a man named Walter Whitmore had shown them what that looked like. Delaney stood and told the story of fixing Cody's motorcycle in the blizzard. I almost didn't stop, she admitted. I almost left him there because I was afraid we'd miss this funeral. But then I remembered what we were here to honor, and I realized that if I left him, I'd be dishonoring everything Walter Whitmore stood for. So we stopped. We fixed his bike together, and we all made it here, together, because that's what brothers do. Cody stood next, his young face earnest. I'm 24 years old. I've been riding for 3 years. Last night I thought my journey was over. I thought I'd let everyone down, but they stopped for me, all of them. And I learned something that no amount of riding could have taught me. The destination doesn't matter as much as who you travel with, and whether you stop when someone falls. Vivian stood and spoke about her husband's funeral 5 years ago. 8 people came. 8. And I swore that day that I would never let anyone else die that alone. That's why I rode 800 miles to be here. Not because I knew Walter Whitmore, but because I know what it feels like to bury someone in silence. And no one deserves that. No one. On and on they spoke, these strangers who had become family in the span of a single night. Each story was different, but they all said the same thing. Brotherhood means something. Courage matters. And the choices we make ripple outward in ways we can never fully understand. Finally, Reverend Thomas stood again. I think it's time we said our final goodbye. The cemetery is 3 miles from here. The family asked that the procession drive slowly. And I believe there's a tradition among motorcycle riders for moments like these. Bear stood up. Yes, Reverend, we call it the final ride. He walked outside and the riders followed, filing out of the church in orderly silence. Eleanor stood beside the casket, placing her hand on the wood one last time. You did good, Walter, she whispered. You did so good. 6 riders chosen by Bear carried the casket out of the church. Eleanor followed, supported by Silas on one side and Bear on the other. As they emerged into the sunlight, the sight that greeted them made Eleanor stop and gasp. 207 motorcycles were lined up in perfect formation, creating a corridor that stretched from the church doors to the waiting hearse. Each rider stood beside their bike, helmet off, head bowed, and as the casket passed between them, each rider raised their right hand in silent salute. The hearse loaded Walter's casket with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such rough-looking people. Then it pulled out slowly, beginning the 3-mile journey to Redwood Cemetery. Behind it, 207 motorcycles roared to life. The sound was incredible, not loud in an obnoxious way, but powerful, thunderous, like a storm rolling across the plains. The bikes fell into formation, creating a procession that stretched for nearly a mile. People came out of their houses to watch. They stood on porches and sidewalks, some with hands over hearts, some saluting, some simply staring in wonder. Eleanor rode in a car behind the hearse, with Bear driving and Silas in the back seat. Through the rear window, she could see the endless line of motorcycles, their headlights blazing in the morning sun, their riders maintaining perfect formation. "How did you organize this?" she asked Bear. "How did you get so many people here so quickly?" Bear glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "I didn't organize anything, ma'am. I just sent a message, told them who Walter was and what he'd done. The riders organized themselves. Some of them rode all night. Some of them called in sick to work. Some of them spent money they didn't have on gas. They came because the code demands it. You don't leave brothers behind, even if you never met them, even if they've been gone from the road for 55 years. "But why?" Eleanor asked. "Why would strangers care this much?" Silas answered from the back seat. "Because we're not strangers, Mrs. Whitmore. We're family. Walter proved that in 1969. He didn't know my father. They'd never met before that day. But when the moment came, when it mattered, Walter treated him like family, like someone worth saving. That's the code. That's what binds us together. And when word got out that Walter's widow needed help, that code demanded we respond." Eleanor thought about this as they drove through Redwood Falls, past Riley's Roadhouse, where this had all begun, past the library where she had worked for 30 years, past the small radio repair shop where Walter had spent 4 decades fixing other people's broken things. She had spent 68 years thinking she knew what family meant. Blood, marriage, the small circle of people who share your name and your history. But these riders had taught her something different. Family was also the people who showed up when you needed them, the people who kept promises to strangers, the people who rode through blizzards and spent their last dollar on gas and sacrificed sleep and comfort because someone, somewhere, needed to know they weren't alone. That was family too. Maybe that was the truest kind of family there was. The cemetery gates stood open, waiting. The procession rolled through slowly, motorcycles spreading out across the grass like a mechanized garden. The riders parked and dismounted in perfect silence, forming a circle around the plot where Walter would be laid to rest. The grave had been dug that morning, a dark rectangle in the earth beside the headstone that read, "David Whitmore, beloved son, 1956 to 1998. Now Walter would join him, father and son, together again." The casket was lowered slowly. Reverend Thomas read from Ecclesiastes, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." As the first shovelful of dirt hit the casket, Silas pulled something from his jacket, an old brass horn tarnished with age. He raised it to his lips and blew 3 long notes, then 2 short ones. The sound echoed across the cemetery, mournful and beautiful. "Thunder Riders salute," he explained to Eleanor. "We play it when a legend goes home." 12 riders stepped forward, all wearing Thunder Riders patches, some of them so old the leather was cracking. They stood at attention around the grave, and one by one, each placed a hand on the casket before it was fully buried. A final touch, a final goodbye. Then something happened that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. A sound in the distance, growing louder. The rumble of an engine that was different from all the others. Older, deeper, a sound from another era. Everyone turned to look. Coming up the cemetery road was a motorcycle that looked like it belonged in a museum. A Harley-Davidson from the 1950s, all chrome and leather, restored to perfect condition. The rider was an old man, probably in his late 80s, wearing a leather jacket that matched the era of his bike. He pulled up to the grave and dismounted slowly, moving with the stiffness of advanced age. When he removed his helmet, Eleanor saw a face weathered by 90 years of living, but eyes that were still sharp and clear. "My name is Finnegan O'Rourke," he said, his voice carrying despite his age. "People called me Finn. I rode with Walter in the Thunder Riders, Phoenix chapter, 1954 to 1969. We were brothers for 15 years. He walked to the grave, moving carefully. "When Walter left the club, he gave me his bike. This bike." He gestured to the vintage Harley. "He made me promise two things. First, keep it running. Second, if he ever died, bring it to his funeral. Ride him home one last time." Finn reached into the motorcycle saddlebag and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. "He also gave me this, said not to open it until this moment." He handed the envelope to Eleanor. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter in Walter's handwriting, but younger, stronger than the shaky script he had used in his final years. The letter was dated April 15th, 1970. Eleanor read it aloud, her voice breaking with emotion. "Finn, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Eleanor is standing at my grave. Tell her I'm sorry for keeping secrets. Tell her the Thunder Riders were real, but she was more real. Tell her I chose her every day for the rest of my life and never once regretted it. Tell her that the bravest thing I ever did wasn't running into fire. It was choosing to stay home, to build a life, to love one person completely instead of the road endlessly. Tell her she made me better than I ever was on my own. And tell the brothers, if any of them are there, that I never forgot them. I just found a different way to live the code. Love your family. Protect the weak. Stop when someone needs help. Live with honor. Die with dignity. That's what Thunder Riders meant to me. That's what Eleanor taught me it could mean. Thank you for keeping your promise, old friend. Now it's time to ride into the sunset. See you on the other side. Walter." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her heart. All this time she had wondered why he kept it secret, why he never told her about this part of his life. Now she understood. It wasn't shame. It wasn't regret. It was completion. He had taken everything he learned on those highways, every value the Brotherhood had taught him, and he had brought it home. To her, to David, to the quiet life they built together. He hadn't abandoned Thunder Riders. He had become Thunder Riders in its purest form. Finn reached into his jacket and pulled out a patch. The original Thunder Riders Phoenix chapter patch, faded and worn, with a lightning bolt piercing a skull. This was Walter's. I've kept it for 55 years. I think it should be buried with him. Eleanor took the patch and placed it carefully on top of the casket before the last shovelful of dirt covered it. A piece of who Walter had been, returning to the earth with him. As the grave was filled, each of the 207 riders walked past and dropped something on the fresh dirt. Coins for luck on the final ride. Patches from their own vests, joining their brotherhood with his. Flowers, photographs, notes written on scraps of paper. By the time everyone had paid their respects, Walter's grave was covered in a mountain of tributes, a visual representation of how many lives he had touched, how far his legend had spread, how deeply his choice to run into fire 55 years ago still resonated. The sun was high in the sky now. The ceremony was ending. Riders were beginning to mount their bikes, preparing for the long journey home to 7 different states. But before they left, Bear approached Eleanor one final time. He handed her a thick envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "From the brothers. We took up a collection last night. $14,500. For you. For whatever you need." Eleanor tried to push it back. "I can't accept this. It's too much." "Mrs. Whitmore, your husband saved 4 lives. Those 4 men had families, children, grandchildren. Hundreds of people exist today because Walter Whitmore stopped his car on a highway in 1969. This money is from those people, from the children and grandchildren who wouldn't be here if not for him. It's not charity, it's gratitude. Eleanor's hands closed around the envelope. Inside was also a card, signed by every single rider who had come. 207 names, covering every inch of space. And at the bottom, in bold letters, "No one leaves this world alone. Iron Brotherhood." "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. "Thank you all." Bear nodded. Then he did something unexpected. He removed his leather vest and placed it around Eleanor's shoulders. It was enormous on her small frame, hanging almost to her knees. "You're an honorary member now. First person ever to receive that honor without riding. You earned it by loving a Thunder Rider well enough to let him be both things at once." The vest had a patch on the back, Iron Brotherhood, and underneath someone had already sewn a new patch. Honorary member number 1, Eleanor Whitmore. One by one, the motorcycles roared to life. They pulled out of the cemetery in formation, creating one final procession past Walter's grave. As each rider passed, they raised their right hand in salute. 207 salutes for a man who had lived 93 years and changed the world in ways he never knew. Eleanor stood beside the grave, wearing a leather vest that smelled of oil and road and brotherhood, and she waved goodbye to an army of strangers who had become family overnight. As the last motorcycle disappeared down the road, the cemetery fell silent. Eleanor stood alone beside the fresh earth, looking down at the tributes covering her husband's grave. "You old fool," she said softly, smiling through her tears. "All these years I thought you were ordinary. All these years you let me think you were just a quiet man who fixed radios. But you were extraordinary, weren't you? You just wore it quietly." She touched the patch on the vest. "I understand now. Why you left. Why you never told me. You didn't want to be a legend. You wanted to be a husband, a father, a neighbor. And you were. You were all those things perfectly, but you were a legend too. You just didn't need the world to know it." Eleanor turned and walked back to the car where George was waiting to drive her home. As she climbed in, she looked back one last time at the grave covered in brotherhood. "Goodbye, Walter," she whispered. "Thank you for 68 years. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for showing me what love looks like when it's brave enough to be ordinary." 6 months passed. On a warm Sunday in May, Eleanor Whitmore walked into Riley's Roadhouse Diner wearing her Iron Brotherhood vest. She sat in the same booth where she had first asked for help, and within minutes, Bear, Vivian, and Delaney walked through the door. This had become their tradition. Once a month, they met for coffee. They talked about Walter, about rides they were planning, about the code they lived by. Eleanor had become something unexpected in her 91st year. She had become part of a family she never knew existed. "How are you doing, Ellie?" Bear asked, using the familiar name Walter had called her. "I'm good," she said truthfully. "I'm really good." And she was. The loneliness that had consumed her after Walter's death had been replaced by something else. Connection, purpose, the knowledge that she was part of something larger than herself. Every month, letters arrived from riders across the country, updates on their lives, photographs of their families, stories about times they had stopped to help someone because they remembered what Walter Whitmore had done. The legend was still alive. It was just riding different roads. Delaney pulled out her phone and showed Eleanor a photograph. "We're organizing another ride next month. Funeral for a widow in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. 87 years old, no family. We're expecting about 150 riders." Eleanor smiled. "Good, that's good." Bear leaned back in the booth. "You know, Ellie, we've been thinking. What Walter did, stopping to help those riders in '69, it started something, a tradition. The Thunder Riders used to do it informally, but after Walter's funeral, we decided to make it official. We're calling it the Wrench Protocol." "The Wrench Protocol?" "Yeah, anytime we hear about a veteran or a rider, or anyone who served others their whole life, anyone who's going to be buried alone, we mobilize. We make sure they have people there. We make sure they're honored. We make sure no one leaves this world alone." Vivian added, "We've done 6 funerals since Walter's. We're planning 12 more. The word is spreading. Other clubs are adopting it. It's becoming a thing." Eleanor felt tears forming, but they were good tears, happy tears. "Walter would love that." "We think so too," Bear said. "He started something without knowing it. Now we're just continuing what he began." They sat together in that booth for 2 hours, drinking coffee and sharing stories. Outside, the world moved on. Cars passed. People went about their ordinary lives. But in that booth, surrounded by leather and Brotherhood, Eleanor Whitmore felt something she had not felt since Walter died. She felt complete, because she finally understood what her husband had known all along. Legends aren't made by the extraordinary things people do. They're made by ordinary people choosing to do the right thing when it would be easier to look away, to stop when someone needs help, to run toward fire instead of away from it, to love completely even when the world offers you freedom. That was the real legend of Walter Whitmore. Not that he pulled 4 men from burning wreckage, though that was heroic, but that he came home afterward and made breakfast for his wife for 68 years. That he fixed radios for neighbors who couldn't pay. That he attended church and mowed his lawn and lived a quiet life and never once demanded recognition for the hero he had been. He had taught Eleanor that courage doesn't always look like fire and danger. Sometimes it looks like showing up every day, like keeping promises, like choosing love over legend and never regretting it. And now, 6 months after his death, that lesson was rippling outward, touching lives he would never know about, inspiring people he would never meet, creating a tradition that would outlast them all. The wrench protocol. No one leaves this world alone. As Eleanor left the diner that day, wearing her leather vest with pride, she thought about the question that had haunted her the night she found those photographs. Why had Walter kept it secret? Now she knew. He hadn't kept it secret to hide it from her. He had kept it secret because it didn't define him. It was part of who he had been, but not who he chose to become. He had taken the code he learned on those highways, the brotherhood and courage and loyalty, and he had woven it into every day of their marriage, into every radio he fixed, into every morning he woke up beside her. He had been a thunder rider every single day of his life. He just didn't need the patch to prove it. That evening, Eleanor visited Walter's grave. The tributes had been collected and preserved, but the patch she had placed on his casket remained buried with him. She stood beside the headstone, which now bore his name and dates, and a simple phrase the Brotherhood had paid to have inscribed. Walter Wrench Whitmore, 1931 to 2024. He ran toward the fire. He chose love. He never left anyone alone. "I met some of your family today," Eleanor said to the stone. "They're good people, Walter. You would like them. They're carrying on what you started, making sure no one dies alone, making sure legends live on." She paused, looking at the inscription. "You were right, you know, about me not being alone. I thought you meant I'd remember you. I thought you meant I'd have memories. But you meant more than that, didn't you? You meant I'd have them. The brothers. The family you left behind that never forgot you." Eleanor placed a white rose on the grave, the same kind that had covered his casket. "Thank you for giving me 68 years. Thank you for being ordinary enough to love and extraordinary enough to inspire. Thank you for showing me that the bravest thing a person can do is choose to stay." As she walked back to her car, Eleanor heard the distant rumble of motorcycles on the highway, heading somewhere, riding towards something, maybe another funeral, maybe just another road. But they were together, and they would stop if someone needed help, because that was the code. That was what Walter Whitmore had taught them all those years ago when he pulled 4 men from burning wreckage and changed the world without meaning to. Brotherhood means something. Courage matters, and no one ever leaves this world alone. That was Walter's legacy. Not the fire, not the rescue, but the simple, profound truth that we're all connected, that stopping to help someone, even a stranger, creates ripples that spread across decades and states and lives we'll never know about. Eleanor drove home as the sun set over Redwood Falls, casting long shadows across the small town where she had lived for 70 years. In her rearview mirror, she could see the cemetery growing smaller, Walter's grave disappearing into the distance. But he wasn't really there. Not anymore. He was on every highway where riders stopped to help broken-down motorists. He was in every funeral where 200 people showed up for someone who thought they would die alone. He was in every quiet act of courage, every choice to run toward fire instead of away from it, every person who looked at someone in need and decided to stop. Walter Whitmore had ridden into the sunset 55 years ago, but the thunder of his legend still rolled across the land, louder than ever, carried forward by people who understood that the truest form of brotherhood is making sure no one faces the darkness alone. And somewhere, on some road Eleanor couldn't see, she imagined Walter riding again. Young and strong, the way he looked in those photographs, riding alongside the brothers who had come to honor him. Riding